In 1901, an Austrian scientist named Karl Landsteiner sat in his laboratory, mixing blood samples from his colleagues, watching some of them clump together into strange, deadly clusters, while others mixed together perfectly fine. He had just accidentally discovered the ABO blood group system, finding so important it would eventually win him a Nobel Prize and make modern blood transfusions possible for the first time in human history. But what Landsteiner could never have known, sitting in that lab over a century ago, is that the very blood type sitting inside his own veins was carrying a genetic fingerprint stretching back not just thousands, but potentially millions of years, deep into the ancestry of every single human being alive today, and possibly even into species that were not fully human at all. Because when modern geneticists finally sequenced ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal bones and traced the evolutionary history of the ABO gene itself, they found something that connects every person who has ever lived, of every race, every continent, every era of human history, back to a single shared genetic story rooted deep in Africa, one that scientists are still piecing together today. So if you think a blood type is just a simple medical detail printed on a card in your wallet, stay with me. Because DNA is revealing that it might be one of the oldest and most revealing genetic records carried inside the human body. Let's start with the fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Your blood type is not unique to humans at all. The ABO blood group system, the same one determining whether you are type A, B, AB, or O, is not something that evolved specifically in our species. It predates humanity entirely. Researchers studying the genetics of our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, found that they too carry versions of the A and O. Alleles, meaning the genetic machinery responsible for blood type, has been sitting inside the primate lineage for millions of years, passed down through a common ancestor we shared with chimps long before Homo sapiens ever existed as a distinct species. This single fact completely reframes what a blood type actually is. It is not some modern human invention or a random genetic accident unique to our species. It is an ancient piece of evolutionary machinery, older than humanity itself, that we simply inherited from deep primate ancestry and then kept refining, mutating, and reshaping across millions of years of evolution. Now, here's where the actual detective story begins, because geneticists studying the ABO gene have spent decades arguing over a genuinely difficult question: which blood type came first? For a long time, the assumption was that type O must be the original ancestral blood type, since O blood carries no A or B antigens on its red blood cells, making it the so-called universal donor that can be given to almost anyone in an emergency transfusion. It felt logical that the simplest, most neutral version of something would have come first, with the more complex A and B versions evolving later as additions. But when researchers actually sequenced and compared the ABO gene sequences across humans and other primates in detail, the results told a different, more complicated story. Multiple evolutionary genetic studies have found that the A allele appears to be the most ancient version of the gene, the original ancestral form, while both the O and B alleles actually evolved later as mutations branching off from that original A sequence. The O allele, it turns out, is created by a very specific genetic deletion, a single piece of the ABO gene simply missing, causing the enzyme normally responsible for building the A or B antigen to become completely inactive, essentially producing a blood type through the absence of a function rather than the presence of one. And in a detail that makes this even messier for scientists trying to build a clean evolutionary timeline, researchers have discovered that this exact same O causing deletion has independently occurred through several different genetic mutation pathways at different points in history, meaning type O blood was not created by a single event passed down cleanly through generations, but by multiple separate genetic accidents happening at different times, all landing on a similar biological outcome. Despite that genetic complexity, evolutionary geneticists remain unified on one basic fact. Whether the very first mutation happened in Africa or somewhere else, the deep evolutionary roots of the ABO gene, along with essentially all of modern human genetic diversity, trace back to Africa, the birthplace of Homo sapiens as a species. Every population of modern humans found anywhere on Earth today descends from ancestors who lived in Africa before a series of migrations, beginning sometime around 60 to 70,000 years ago, carried groups of humans outward into the Middle East, then into Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually, tens of thousands of years later, across a land bridge into the Americas. And this single historical fact turns out to explain almost everything strange and uneven about how blood types are distributed around the modern world today. Here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because when researchers map global blood type frequencies today, they find patterns so extreme, so specific to certain regions, that they read almost like a genetic record of humanity's entire migration history. In present-day African populations, researchers find all three major ABO alleles, A, B, and O, segregating together, meaning African populations retain the deepest, most complete genetic diversity of blood types found anywhere in the world, exactly what you would expect from the ancestral homeland where humanity spent the vast majority of its evolutionary history before any migration ever began. As populations moved out of Africa and into Europe, researchers found D type A and O become the dominant blood groups, with type B comparatively rare, showing up in only around 5 to 10% of European populations. Move further east into Asia, and the pattern shifts again, with type B blood becoming considerably more common than it is anywhere in Europe. But the most extreme and genuinely striking example of all comes from the Americas, because in indigenous Native American populations, researchers have found type O blood is virtually fixed, meaning it approaches nearly 100% of the entire population in some indigenous groups. An almost unbelievable level of genetic uniformity for a single trait across an entire continent's worth of people. Why would type O become almost universal, specifically among indigenous Americans? The answer connects directly back to how small founding migrant populations shape entire future gene pools. When the ancestors of indigenous Americans crossed into the Americas thousands of years ago, likely through multiple waves of migration across the Bering Land Bridge region, they represented a relatively small founding population compared to the much larger, more genetically diverse populations they had left behind in Asia. In population genetics, this kind of scenario, where a small subset of a larger population becomes isolated and goes on to found an entirely new population on its own, is called a founder effect, and it means that whatever specific genetic variants happen to be present purely by chance in that small founding group become the dominant genetic signature for every single descendant that follows, sometimes for thousands of years afterward. If the founding population that crossed into the Americas happened to carry a very high frequency of the O allele, simply through random chance combined with the small size of the founding group, that same overwhelming O type, dominance would then get passed forward and amplified across every subsequent generation. Eventually producing the striking near-total O-type uniformity researchers observe across indigenous American populations today, a genetic echo of one specific, small founding migration event that happened many thousands of years ago. Now let's talk about why these different blood types spread and persisted in different regions in the first place, because this is where blood type stops being a simple genetic curiosity and becomes something with genuinely life or death consequences, written into human evolutionary history. Researchers studying the connection between blood type and infectious disease have found that different ABO blood types offer measurably different levels of resistance or vulnerability to specific pathogens, meaning your blood type has, quite literally, been a matter of survival for your ancestors, shaped by exactly which diseases they were forced to survive in whatever region they happened to live in. One of the clearest and most well-documented examples involves malaria, one of the deadliest infectious diseases in all of human history, responsible for shaping human genetics across huge portions of Africa, the Mediterranean, and Asia for thousands of years. Researchers have found that people with type O blood carry a genuine biological advantage against the most severe and lethal forms of malaria infection, because the malaria parasite has a harder time forming the specific clumping structures inside blood vessels that cause the most dangerous, often fatal complications of the disease when it is operating inside type O blood cells specifically, in regions where malaria has been a persistent, devastating threat for thousands of years. This protective advantage would have provided a genuine survival edge to individuals carrying the O allele, generation after generation, gradually increasing the overall frequency of type O blood within populations living in these malaria-heavy regions over enormous stretches of evolutionary time. But here is the twist that makes this story so much more complicated and interesting than a simple one-directional advantage, because that same protective quality against malaria comes with a serious cost attached. Researchers studying cholera, another historically devastating infectious disease, found the exact opposite pattern. People with type O blood are significantly more likely to develop severe, life-threatening cholera infections compared to people carrying type A or B blood. This means blood type functions almost like an ancient evolutionary trade-off, a genetic gamble, where a specific mutation might save your ancestors from one deadly disease while simultaneously making them more vulnerable to another, and which trade-off ultimately won out in any given region depended entirely on which diseases were actually present and actively killing people there across thousands of years of local history. This is precisely why researchers describe blood type variation as having been under long-term balancing selection throughout primate evolution, meaning natural selection was not simply pushing populations toward one single best blood type across the entire species, but instead constantly balancing multiple competing pressures against each other, region by region, disease by disease, producing the complicated, uneven global map of blood type distribution we still see today. Now let's go even deeper into the fossil record itself. Because in 2025, researchers published genuinely startling findings after analyzing the actual ABO blood type genetics preserved inside ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal and Denisovan remains, alongside early Homo sapiens genomes dating back as far as 46,000 years. A research team, led by geneticist Stéphane Mazieres at Aix-Marseille University, examined genomes from 22 early Homo sapiens individuals who lived between 16,500 and 46,000 years ago, 14 separate Neanderthal. Individuals spanning roughly 40,000 to 120,000 years ago, and even a Denisovan individual, an entirely separate and mysterious branch of ancient humans, known mostly through DNA evidence rather than complete fossils. What they discovered was that Neanderthals themselves carried detectable ABO blood type variants, including specific O-type alleles, and remarkably, certain versions of these ancient Neanderthal blood type genes are still detectable today, quietly persisting inside the genomes of modern human populations, specifically in Europe and Southeast Asia, direct genetic leftovers from the same ancient interbreeding events between Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens that left every non-African modern human population carrying measurable traces of Neanderthal DNA. Researchers even found that the oldest known Neanderthal individual, studied genetically, recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia and often referred to as the Altai Neanderthal, carried type O blood, meaning this specific blood type has now been directly confirmed inside the veins, or at least the fossilized DNA, of a hominin who lived roughly 120,000 years ago. And researchers estimate the underlying O allele itself is likely at least 1 million years old, an almost incomprehensible stretch of evolutionary time for a genetic trait that most people assume is nothing more than a simple, static medical classification listed on a hospital chart. This finding fundamentally reframes what blood type actually represents in the story of human evolution. It is not simply a modern human trait that appeared recently and then spread outward from Africa alongside our species. It is an ancient, deeply conserved piece of genetic architecture that predates Homo sapiens entirely, shared not just with living primates like chimpanzees, but directly confirmed inside the DNA of Neanderthals and quite possibly Denisovans as well, distinct and separate hominin lineages that split off from our own evolutionary path hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans even existed. And through interbreeding events that occurred when early Homo sapiens, migrating out of Africa, encountered and mixed with Neanderthal populations already living across Europe and Asia, fragments of these ancient Neanderthal blood type genetic variants were absorbed directly into the modern human gene pool, meaning that if you are of European or Southeast Asian ancestry today, there's a genuine possibility that specific pieces of the exact genetic code determining your blood type trace back not to Homo sapiens ancestors at all, but to Neanderthals, an entirely separate species of ancient human that went extinct roughly 40,000 years ago. So let's return to the actual question buried inside this whole investigation, whether type O blood is somehow specifically or exclusively African in origin. The honest, evidence-based answer researchers have arrived at is more nuanced and in some ways more interesting than a simple yes or no. Africa is unquestionably the deep ancestral homeland of the entire ABO blood type system, along with every other piece of human genetic diversity, since every population of modern humans on Earth ultimately traces its ancestry back to Africa before the great migrations began spreading humanity across the rest of the globe. In that fundamental evolutionary sense, every blood type carried by every human being alive today, A, B, AB, or O, is African in origin, simply because humanity itself is African in origin. But the specific claim that type O blood is somehow uniquely or exclusively African, as opposed to A or B, does not hold up against the genetic evidence, because researchers have confirmed that all three major ABO alleles, A, B, and O, are found segregating together within African populations today, representing the deepest and most complete genetic diversity of blood types found anywhere on the planet, rather than Africa being home to only one single dominant blood type. And the genetic record shows type O has independently arisen multiple separate times throughout human evolutionary history through different mutation pathways, was already present in Neanderthal populations living in Siberia roughly 120,000 years ago, long before modern humans had even begun their major migrations out of Africa, and reached its highest concentration anywhere in the entire world, not in Africa itself, but among indigenous populations of the Americas, as a direct result of founder effects operating on a small migrating population tens of thousands of years after humans had already left Africa entirely. What the deep genetic research does confirm, and this is genuinely one of the most fascinating threads running through this entire story, is that blood type distribution across the modern world functions as a kind of living historical map, an ongoing genetic record you can still read today, tracing the migration routes our ancestors followed out of Africa, the diseases they were forced to survive in each new region they settled, the small founding populations whose random genetic makeup shaped entire future continents worth of descendants, and even the ancient interbreeding events between our species and other, now extinct branches of humanity like the Neanderthals. Every single time a doctor draws a small vial of your blood and runs a simple test to determine whether you are type A, B, AB, or O, they are, in a very real and literal sense, reading a fragment of a genetic story that stretches back not just through your own family history, but through hundreds of thousands, and by some estimates over 1 million years of evolutionary history, connecting you directly to ancient African ancestors, to the specific diseases that shaped survival in whatever corner of the world your lineage eventually settled, and quite possibly, if your ancestry traces through Europe or Asia, to fragments of genetic code inherited from an entirely separate species of ancient human that vanished from the earth 40,000 years ago. There's one more layer to this story worth sitting with because it reveals just how much further scientists still have to go before this genetic history is fully understood. Alongside the ABO system, researchers also study something called the rhesus or Rh blood group system, the genetic factor determining whether your blood type carries the positive or negative designation you see attached to your ABO type, such as O positive or O negative. Ancient DNA research examining Rh factor frequencies across European populations over the past 10,000 years has revealed something researchers describe as genuinely surprising, that some ancient European populations carried Rh factor frequencies that were more extreme, more skewed toward either the positive or negative variant than any single modern population shows today. Evidence of dramatic genetic shifts and population replacements happening across European prehistory that completely reshaped the Rh landscape multiple times over thousands of years, in patterns strikingly similar to the population replacement stories uncovered in ancient DNA from Scotland, Spain, and Ireland. This tells us that even the specific plus or minus sign attached to your blood type carries its own hidden layer of ancient migration history, layered directly on top of the already ancient ABO story, meaning your complete blood type. That simple 4-character combination, like O positive or A negative, is actually the visible surface expression of 2 entirely separate, deeply ancient genetic stories, running simultaneously underneath, each one shaped by different migrations, different founder populations, and different evolutionary pressures across hundreds of thousands of years of human and pre-human history. So the next time you glance down at a blood donation card or see your blood type listed on a medical form or casually mention it in conversation without a second thought, remember what modern genetic research has actually uncovered hiding underneath that simple letter and symbol. You're looking at a genetic fossil, a piece of evolutionary machinery older than our species itself, shared with chimpanzees, confirmed inside the DNA of Neanderthals who lived over 100,000 years ago, shaped and reshaped by ancient diseases like malaria and cholera, fighting for dominance across different corners of the globe, and scattered unevenly across the modern world today as a direct, readable consequence of exactly which small groups of ancestors happened to migrate where, and exactly which diseases those ancestors were forced to survive along the way. It is not simply a medical detail, it is a message, encoded in the molecules of your own blood, connecting you across an almost unimaginable stretch of time to ancestors in Africa, to the great migrations that carried humanity across every continent on Earth, and quite possibly to an entirely different species of human who disappeared from this planet tens of thousands of years before recorded history ever began, and whose genetic fingerprint, remarkably, is still quietly circulating through your veins today.